Hi, everybody, and welcome to our third program in a four-part series on the American media. In this program, we bring Americans who are working in the US media into conversation with Russian students and journalists. Our goal is to provide insight into how the American media operates and analysis of how it's dealing with important American issues. So this program is of interest, I think, to our Russian audience who is trying to understand America and understand our media principles. Today we're talking to Dana Kester and Kristen Uppercue of West Virginia University, and our topic is National Problems in Small Town America, how local media reports on the political divide in West Virginia. My name is Michael Beckelheimer. I was born and raised in West Virginia. I studied Russian in Moscow. I live in Los Angeles, and I'm joining you today from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm working with Valentina Vasilyeva, a Russian TV journalist who currently works in Washington, D.C. as a reporter for Voice of America. And she and I have curated this series together. The program is presented by the Washington-based Forum for Cultural Engagement in coordination with the American Center in Moscow and the US Embassy. And we've partnered with the Russian State University for the Humanities in Moscow, and specifically with our friend, Professor Victoria Zhuravlyova. She's a professor of American history and international relations and the head of the American Studies Department. And today we have students from the American Studies Department and the Journalism Department participating in this discussion, as well as student participants from the Moscow Pedagogical State University and Moscow State University's Department of Journalism. So today's session will last 1 hour. It's being recorded and will be publicly available on the website of the American Center in Moscow. For those of you on Zoom, post your questions at any time. I'm encouraging questions, please, in the Zoom chat. For those of you on Facebook, please feel free to post your comments on there as well, and I'll be able to answer those. And halfway through, we're going to open up to video questions. So if you want to go on video, at some point, we'll announce that capability. So again, this is being recorded. It'll be available forever. Okay, today we're talking about a region in the US called Appalachia. And this region stretches from the south up into Pennsylvania and sort of into the state of New York. And West Virginia is the only state that is completely within Appalachia. And this is a very personal topic for me because I'm from West Virginia, grew up in the Appalachia region, and I'm really excited to share information about this region with our audience today. Let me introduce you to our guests so we can get this conversation started. Dana Kester is a journalism professor at West Virginia University's Reed College of Media. She's also the creative director for their Media Innovation Center. And she is the founder and editor-in-chief for the media project 100 Days in Appalachia. And she's currently directing 2 documentary films. One is Raised by Wolves, about youth and online hate in the region. And the other is a documentary about Muslim in Appalachia. And today we're going to talk about all of those topics. One of her former students is also joining us today. Kristen Uppercue recently got her master's degree from the College of Media at West Virginia University. She has written stories for the 100 Days in Appalachia project and is now the deputy editor for special projects. So Dana and Kristen, thank you for being here. Dana, before we talk about the 100 Days project, which is where we're going to start, let's set the stage. How do you describe the region of Appalachia and the state of West Virginia? What's your interest in this region? Are you battling the misperceptions of this region? So give us some background on that, please.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, you sort of laid it out geographically. I think it surprises people that it is, more than 26 million people, 13 states. It is not just the central Appalachia of popular imagination, which tends to be Kentucky and West Virginia, the coal fields. But I would note that probably this audience, like many and other international audiences, have a sort of probably have their familiarity with Appalachia through cultural stereotypes that are in media and television and film, even cartoons. But I would say that that other Americans have that same stereotype of the region. So it's not just an international phenomenon. But in addition to being geographically diverse, it has religious diversity, ethnic and racial diversity, political diversity. The very first story that we published at 100 Days in Appalachia was part of a series called Muslim in Appalachia. And it was sort of to say to external audiences, whatever you think you know about this region, we're here to challenge that. So the whole point was to introduce perspectives that get lost in those national and international cultural frames, but also to say and remind people it's a microcosm of how diverse other regions are in the US that are also often painted in one dimension, like stereotypes that people have about California or the West. And so it's trying to shift people out of that, both how they look at us, but also how they look at their own communities.
Great. So talk just a little bit about the misperceptions about Appalachia. How are Appalachians stereotyped by the American media and by Americans in general?
Well, I mean, it tends to predominantly be, at its worst, it's sort of really vile hillbilly stereotypes that are, extremely condescending. And I don't even want to repeat them here to amplify them. But also that it's overwhelmingly poor, that it is only white, it's only coal miners. I mean, there's just these really narrow frames. And so, and I'm sure Kristen can also sort of speak to that as well.
Yes. So Kristen, you're from West Virginia. So what can you say a few words about what it's like to be from West Virginia, and what are some of the things that you've noticed about how people stereotype us?
Yeah. So I'm from West Virginia. I've always lived here. I went to college here. My family's here. So I remember when we would go and travel around the country, actually, the number one thing we would always hear is, wow, your accent. And like, I don't think I have an accent, but my mom, she definitely does. She's from Southern West Virginia. So she sounds like she's from Southern West Virginia. And I absolutely love her voice. I love her family's voice. And so I always thought that was so weird. Like, wow, people that was the thing that they always pointed out. But I think when you're talking about the media representations, like Dana said, when your people are portrayed as kind of some of the worst parts of society, it reflects the way that you look at your own communities. It reflects it and impacts the ways that you look at yourself. And so growing up, my thing was, I'll go to college and then I'll leave and I'm not going to come back. And I didn't do that. I went to college and then I went to grad school, and I'm still here because I kind of fell in love with Appalachia, with West Virginia, because I was able to learn about the people and learn about our culture and kind of see it reflected in my own family and in myself. But, growing up here, it took until I started working with Dana to kind of get over that shame and the impacts that you feel because of the media representations.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. It's so good to hear stories of people who grow up and stay. I'm one of those who grew up and left. And, your point about the accent, my first Russian professor in college laughed at my accent in Russian. He said, in Russian, you have this weird Southern accent. And that was, now my accent, I think, is mostly gone. But if you could talk to my mom and dad, you would hear it. We're from Southern West Virginia. Yeah. Okay, I want to talk a bit about the political divide in West Virginia and the political situation there. Again, before we get into this deeper topic about what 100 Days in Appalachia is doing for West Virginia and how the Raised by Wolves documentary is revealing a lot of issues with white supremacism and extremism. But let's start with politics and news. So you both are journalists by profession and training, and Dana, you teach journalism. And the question of where do West Virginians get their news, I think, is an important one. And for our audience in Russia, just so you know, I'm thinking about how most people in West Virginia are conservative. They vote for Republicans. A very large majority voted for Donald Trump twice. And I'm assuming this means West Virginians watch a lot of Fox News. And I would like, Dana, you to tell us a little bit about news consumption in West Virginia. Where do West Virginians get their news? And is the national media responsible, or what role does the national media play in pushing West Virginia further and further to the right?
Wow, a lot to unpack there. Well, one thing that I would mention in sort of understandings of West Virginia, sort of famously flipping from, a blue state to a red state, is that in fact, in 2016, Bernie Sanders overwhelmingly won the presidential primary in West Virginia. And that group of voters overlapped with voters who ultimately voted for Trump. So it's a little more complicated than that. And in the 2014 midterm elections, we saw a huge jump in voters who identified themselves as independent. So there was some early signs that people were becoming dissatisfied with sort of the national political frame of that two-party system. So I think there's some interesting dynamics there. In regards to where they get their coverage, that's complicated too. There's probably not a one-size-fits-all answer. And also there's still kind of a thriving local media ecosystem that people don't think is happening in rural and small areas. There's a lot of small weeklies that still serve their communities. I think, we have so much attention on what's happening on the internet and Facebook and all of these things, but people are still getting a lot of their news from television and radio. And so those are still factors, which is not to discount the role that the internet has played in sort of amplifying divisions and extremes. And then in response to what's the role that American media plays, I mean, this is one of the things that we really are trying to push back on with 100 Days, which is those binary narratives, us versus them, red versus blue, rural versus urban. I mean, so much of the conventions of journalism itself frame narratives around divides. And then another thing that I think that happens in journalism is that view from nowhere perspective that national and especially coastal media adopt. And I think it's meant to convey objectivity, but really it kind of ends up being this steady stream of othering. I'm often asking national journalists when they're reporting, who are you talking about and who are you talking to? And sometimes they get caught off guard by that question because they haven't thought about what the answer is to that. And I think that's something we have to do.
And so you call this news from nowhere?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like if you're reading something from I actually don't want to say any outlets, but an elite coastal media outlet, and they talk about West Virginia or Ohio or Iowa or Missouri or any of the sort of flyover country spaces as another. Mm-hmm. And So, but then my question is, well, who are you talking to? Are you only, because if you're a national outlet, then are you by default sort of revealing that your audience is a narrow coastal elite and not those people you're talking about? And I think that's part of where the sort of distrust in media has crept in when you're the, it's like if you overhear people talking about you instead of to you and with you.
Right. That's an interesting way to put it. And so I would like to turn to the 100 Days in Appalachia project. And I'm going to find this quote that is on your website. And I think it's what you just described as a nice segue. The national media has failed Appalachia. They have exploited our struggles, dividing our nation. We are more alike than different. And there is a hopeful story about Appalachia that's not being told. And so, and in other conversations we've had, Dana, you've talked about how West Virginia is misrepresented in the national media and failed. And this was part of the impetus for you, the reason to create this media project, 100 Days in Appalachia. Can you tell us about that project and why you started it?
Yeah, so we literally the day after the 2016 election founded 100 Days in Appalachia. And it was in response to a year of national narratives that had cast an entire region over and over again as Trump country. And we just saw that in the New Yorker, the Guardian, New York Times. And we knew in our region and how diverse our region is that there was much more to that. So we thought this was, frankly, we were fed up. So it was a really just a good opportunity to say, no, let us tell you what Appalachia is. And so we sort of came out very assertive with that perspective. I mean, honestly, I would say our initial audience was other journalists and people outside the region. It wasn't like, let's start an outlet to serve news up to Appalachian. It was, let's get a bunch of Appalachians together to do the reporting about our region for the rest of the world to consume. And just also to make that point that, every county in Appalachia has its own stories. And we wanted to share some of those with the rest of the world, and recognizing that when national media, like I mentioned before, they gravitate toward some simple stories that have drama, stories that have conflict, but that ends up only telling one tiny, prism of as our colleague professor in Russia mentioned, something that's much more faceted than that.
Mm-hmm. So can you give us, so I remember that time. So after that year leading up to Trump's election, and then all of the stories that were coming out of West Virginia, there was a huge interest, I think, across the country to understand who are these people in West Virginia who love Trump and absolutely hate Hillary Clinton, and they love coal, and where did they come from? And now just even today, I mean, West Virginia has, sort of our phrase, punches above their weight. They have a lot of power in Washington. And it's a very interesting, I mean, we've always known it's an interesting place, but I think your point that 100 Days in Appalachia was a media project to present a better image, a more nuanced image of West Virginia to the people who were writing about West Virginia, to the journalists, yes, the people who wanted to understand West Virginia. So can you give me an example of how you make a story about a small town in West Virginia that maybe has a terrible economic situation, is suffering from closed coal mines, the economy is down, and the opioid addiction problem is up. How do you create a story around that is broader than that narrow, bad story about West Virginia? Like, what makes it a good story in your eyes?
Well, I mean, one of the things, and I honestly, I wrestle with this, and I wrestled with this when I'm working with other outlets that we collaborate with or other editors. And we actually wrote it into our sort of story guidelines. Like, we don't do a feature about a person. And even like in this extremism reporting, it's really important to that too. We really try and do reporting that's about systems, not a town, a picturesque town that represents this, a person that represents this. We really try and flip that. And it's hard. I mean, that kind of reporting is really hard. It takes a deep dive. It asks a lot of the reader to stay with you. That's partly why in this one project, we're working on a documentary instead of a reported story or a print, actually not print, text, to sort of ask the reader to help to stay with us while we try and unpack all of the systemic issues that are at play. But our readers, I think, have come to know that is how we do our reporting. And so, an example is, I mean, we didn't do the story, but I think it's a really good example of how to cover opioids. Eric Eier did, there had been a decade of stories about an addict or what happened to the family and the children, the orphans of addiction. And that story was told over and over and over again. And then the story that Eric Eier told, which won a Pulitzer Prize, as it absolutely should have, was a database story that just looked at the sheer number of prescriptions that were written in one county. And of course, that was groundbreaking work that led to a kind of raising the consciousness for people to understand the economic manifestation of big pharma and extraction in a region and what makes people susceptible. I mean, it was just, that to me was a way to tell that story. And we strive to emulate that in our reporting.
I'm glad you mentioned that. For our audience, when Valentina and I were putting together this series, one of the topics that we really wanted to bring out was investigative journalism in the United States. And that's what immediately drew me to West Virginia, Dana, actually, is there's so many groundbreaking stories about addiction and pharmaceutical companies that have come out of West Virginia, wonderful examples of investigative journalism. And as you said, he won a Pulitzer Prize for that story. So it's a place rich with stories that, as you say, are relevant on the national level. Kristen, you write for 100 Days in Appalachia. What kinds of stories are you drawn to in Appalachia and in West Virginia, and what are you reporting on?
Yeah, so I write occasionally. Now I'm kind of more focused on some of our more in-depth research projects. So I've been working a lot with Dana and helping with research in these projects we'll talk about here in a minute. But I also, I think one thing that I love kind of bringing to the table and that I think we do really well is our youth-focused stories. So we have an amazing editor, Rainsford Stauffer. She just published a book about youth in America and American systems. So if anyone's more interested in learning about that, I highly recommend her book. But she leads a project for us called the Appalachian Youth Creators Project. And it's where we just let young people talk about their experiences in the region and their experiences with the systems that, like Dana said, we do investigate and dive into. And it gives that personal story and those personal narratives, but in a way where they're the ones telling that narrative. And it's not, people from outside of their community telling it about them.
So they're creators. They're creating the content. Is it video? Are they writing?
Whatever they want to do. So we've published poetry, we've published reported articles, commentaries, any way that they want to express themselves. They have the full freedom to.
Interesting. And is all of that on 100 Days or is that a separate? Okay.
It's all on 100 Days. So if you go to 100 Days website, you can look up Appalachian Youth Creators Project. It's all right there.
Cool. And is it mostly students from where? West Virginia, Kentucky? Is it all over?
All over the region. Yeah. So we have high schoolers and college students who they get to write and express themselves.
That's interesting. I mean, I think that's a a really interesting topic for the Russian audience as well, I assume. Is young, student reporters. I know that there have been some news stories recently about student reporters and journalists in Russia, and I think it's a great tradition we have of getting young people involved in journalism early on.
Yeah.
So this sounds like a really interesting outlet. So then let's turn to one of the darker stories coming out of the region, which also has, it resonates across the country, and that's the story of white supremacy and extremism. And so a couple things that I think would be interesting to talk about. One, I understand that part of the 100 Days in West Virginia project involved having reporters from your organization in Kentucky for a white supremacist rally. And Dana, we talked about that briefly in Pikesville, Kentucky, which they make a great bourbon there that I love. And so now after we have this conversation, I want to know if I should continue drinking it. But can you tell us a little bit about that event? Because I mean, it represents what we're seeing a lot of in this country, and you were there to cover it.
Yeah, I mean, it actually was a pretty seminal moment for 100 Days because the Pikeville rally was on day 100 of the Trump administration, and which was supposed to be our final day of reporting. We were originally envisioned as this sort of pop-up project, but we covered the event. I mean, it's right square in central Appalachia. And then we decided that day that it was actually sort of a day one for us for moving forward, and also seeing how necessary and important our regional perspective, access, expertise was going to be in covering to ethically and responsibly cover extremism from within. And honestly, that day in Pikeville was like a Fellini circus of national, international, reporters from all over the place in their, journalism costumes, I like to say. And I am not at all saying that national and international media shouldn't cover this topic. It's important. And some of the best colleagues that I've established through this reporting have been through folks that we met actually at Pikeville. But I am saying that local media has to be at the forefront of covering this issue with depth and accountability because it is in our communities.
So so then what was the response? What is the response in West Virginia when you all are talking about white supremacism and these right-wing extremist rallies? Do you get much support for that?
We do. We frankly have been targeted, and I mean that's an issue I think for any journalists who are doing this work. We try and be very careful what I'm saying now because of that. But I would say overwhelmingly because we are part of our communities. We are not. I think we have more credibility in our own regions, and we try and do deep engagement with all affected community members and targeted community members to make sure we're doing this reporting, and also again in a way that looks at the systems that give rise to it, as opposed to just targeting an individual or doing a profile of the Nazi next door kind of thing. We don't do that.
Right. So is that experience what led to the documentary project Raised by Wolves, or what's the connection there?
Both. I mean, we actually had been working on that research prior to launching 100 Days, just from other things that we'd been seeing happening online. But it certainly sort of, amplified or, made it even all the more important to focus on. So, yeah.
Great. A note to the audience, please feel free to submit questions on Zoom or on Facebook. And Robert, if you want to open up the mics and the cameras for the participants on Zoom, everyone's welcome to join in and ask questions. All right, so Dana, let's talk about this documentary film, Raised by Wolves. Can you tell us a little bit about what you were researching and what you were noticing and why you decided to take on this topic of extremism?
Yeah, sure. So we actually were noticing, I mean, we're parents and we have children. And we were noticing a rise in memes and other sort of online activities in sort of our own kids' peer groups, where there was some pretty, blatant, extremism, bubbling up, a lot of anti-Semitic, a lot of anti-Muslim content. And we were seeing this come up in gaming spaces and mainstream platforms, Instagram primarily, and the early work that we were looking at. And we also started to see how much of that was not rooted in the behaviors of children, but was coordinated, and they were being targeted. And that, of course, was very interesting to us as journalists and parents. So we really started to dive in to try and map what those ecosystems were, who those players were, actors. When we say the title is Raised by Wolves, and it's a lot of different wolves that are the factors influencing what we were calling the feral boys of the internet, where they were spending so much time in these spaces, in a way hiding in plain sight, but also invisible to parents, teachers, mental health caregivers, others. So the documentary tries to really look at what is that ecosystem, what gives rise to it, who are the actors, who are the wolves, and why are children at risk in these spaces.
Is this primarily focused on children in West Virginia, or is it across the country or across Appalachia?
Well, because we're here and Appalachia is sort of the narrative that we have experience and access and some authority to speak to, it is focused in Appalachia. But I definitely want to, emphasize in no way is it a thing that's unique to kids in Appalachia. It is a suburban issue. It's an urban issue. It's a global problem, and it's definitely across. There are other areas in the U.S. experiencing this: California, the Pacific Northwest, and a lot of the other folks that I talk to and work with are doing this work, doing similar work in those regions. But I think anywhere that you can see, historic racism, systemic dysfunction, when we start to have issues around lack of access to education, healthcare, jobs, that is going to be part of that fertile territory, as you had said. But also, I just really want to emphasize it's not just an Appalachian issue. And also, Pikeville Rally was designed by people external to the region, because Appalachia is a great narrative for that, for their intents and purposes. So, it's complicated.
Meaning Appalachia is fertile territory. Would you say that that youth and kids in Appalachia are more open to these messages and more sort of susceptible to the ideas?
Well, I think there are things that play into susceptibility. I think when you have, and again, I don't want to, we're actually working on a whole other project about boys in Appalachia, because I want to make sure that I'm not, the documentary talks about one thing, but then we're also telling this other richer story about what it's like to be a teen boy in Appalachia. And it's a really cool project that Kristen's editing, actually. But so, there are things that are going to contribute to susceptibility. I mean, those are, when you have homes that are disrupted by an opioid epidemic, and where you may in some counties have more than 70% of youth living with other caregivers that are not their parents. There may be aging caregivers that are not as technologically savvy and sort of on top of. And I can just say, as a parent for myself who's made it my job to understand this, it's really, really hard to sort of see how all of this moves and where it's happening and how to protect your kids from it. And when you have a region or a county or even just a school district where if there are, there's very few resources and there's not after school programs, and then you have geographic remoteness, and then now you have kids spending a huge amount of time, on devices as a form of entertainment or babysitting, or you have a pandemic and now suddenly people are remote and on their devices for 24 hours a day. I mean, there's like a lot of things that add to susceptibility. And then I think a lack of diversity in a lot of communities sets a groundwork for that kind of, racial othering, religious minority othering that also can, can take hold. I mean, it's ripe for manipulation. I mean, I really want to point out that I look at susceptible youth and targeted youth both through a lens of empathy, because there is manipulation happening. And, it's not that a fourth grader didn't wake up and decide to, start spewing, hate. It's a long grooming process. Anyway, it's complicated, which is why I hope the documentary will help unpack some of that.
It sounds like you have a few documentaries that are unpacking this. It's too much for one. So on that topic, so Kristen, let me ask you, what can you tell us about teen boys in Appalachia?
Well, I think that Dana covered a lot of some of the external complications and problems that they're facing. But also, I mean, sports are a huge thing here. I don't know. I feel like I shouldn't talk too much about, because I'm not part of this community and that's like the full thing that we're saying. But
that's why I asked you that, because it puts you on the spot. It's like you have to say it. But
I have to say what it means to be a teen boy. But
what are you finding in your research that you think is interesting?
Well, I think the community aspect of sports is one of the most fascinating things. It's something that I relate to, just seeing in family members who also had, like the little league community sports growing up. And we actually, one of the people that our reporter interviewed talked about how the only ways to kind of get out of West Virginia is through either university or sports. And sports being that like big thing that everyone, if you're able, that you really try and focus on. And I thought that was really fascinating that, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
You weren't about to say that sports is an avenue of hatred and
no.
the opposite,
not
right?
at all. No. I'm saying that it's an avenue to community, and it's also for a lot of people an avenue to kind of, I think, young people. I think this is something that I felt, and I think in most small communities around the country, not just in Appalachia, you kind of have this idea that you need to leave to be successful or to find a job. And I think that's also something that's very heavily represented in media that's targeted to young people. This notion of like going to the big city and
Right.
Leaving your small town. And for people who are growing up with sports and who are really good at sports, that's one of the ways to get financial aid and go to university. So that was like one thing that we heard from one teen that I thought was really fascinating. But our reporter, I should say, has talked to a handful of others throughout the state as well. And they all have really interesting stories. So definitely stay tuned to 100 Days for that.
So question here from Ramon. Are there media literacy classes at school or university in America and West Virginia specifically? Which, by the way, I just want to point out to Roman, that next week we'll be talking to a media literacy professor. So come back next week. But what is, are young West Virginians being taught how to analyze what they're seeing and hearing on the internet and in the news?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, and more so now, I think people are recognizing sort of how important that is. I think there's sort of a renewed effort at sort of civics literacy. So digital literacy, media literacy, and civics literacy. But one thing that I would say about young people, and having been a professor and sort of seeing kind of a generation of millennials move through, and now Gen Z coming through. And of course, everybody is so diverse and so unique and different. So I don't want to do that global framing. But there are some things that I am noticing. And sort of younger students coming in are much more savvy about misinformation and disinformation. I think they are frankly less susceptible and growing more so by the day, just as sort of the mechanics of that become more commonly understood. They are much more assertive about digital privacy and digital privacy rights, where I think even just a few years ago, that just wasn't even a concept for a lot of young people. And they're more sort of outspoken, politically informed, more able to talk about, complex economic issues. And they're also very much a part of a global community. They live in these online spaces. Even if they're in West Virginia, they're online playing games with people all over the world. So that also, I think, opens their minds in a way that is a good thing and a really interesting thing. But overall, they're much more savvy.
Yeah. So in doing your research for the documentary Raised by Wolves and looking at how these messages are reaching young, savvy kids, how prevalent is it? Like how many, I'm here in Pittsburgh and I'm playing video games with my nephew. And of course, now I'm on hyper alert. I'm thinking, what does that mean? And, yesterday I picked up a gun and I thought, should I be doing this? So how do you identify where that manipulation is happening? And is that something that you're going to tell us in the documentary? Like what?
Yeah, yes, we are going to tell you in the documentary. We're doing trainings with parents and kids so that they can recognize it themselves. I mean, I wish it was you're probably like want to kick me off this panel because I keep saying it's complicated, no. But and it's a process. So it's not like first of all, there's all kinds of memes there are some really reprehensible memes and, but they're very sophisticatedly designed in youth packaging with cartoon characters. And it starts early. So if a third grader may be starting to engage with some of these edgy memes and have no idea what the larger, representation is, like, they'll use things around superheroes, but also crusades and then those things tend to lead toward other things over time. There's a lot of adjacent content. So, and it's hard to talk about because, I've had journalists before say, professor says video games cause terrorism. I was like, no, never said that. I never, ever, ever said that. And we're not saying that. I'm just saying that when kids are in online games that are multiplayers with servers all over the world, in the same way that other kinds of predators show up to manipulate and groom youth, so do far-right extremists. It's just a thing that I'm not the only person documenting that. And in the same ways, the grooming process can be pretty insidious.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, to be fair and balanced, are far left organizations in on this as well?
That is also a great question. And I can honestly say that in the spaces that we're in, I have not seen that, which is not me trying to, look at one direction over another. It's just the evidence in the spaces that we are looking in, we have not seen it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you, so here's a question very specifically related to our audience today and the fact that we're streaming this for people in Russia. So talking about these memes and the misinformation, we heard a lot about Russian campaigns to create memes that would stir up, feelings in the United States and sort of bring people, sort of divide people over these issues like race and whatever the issues were. Do you find, or have you found evidence that any of this is coming from Russia? Any of this misinformation that's maybe pushing people, youth, in directions towards extremism or white supremacy or violence?
Well, I will not discount the role of state actors, not just Russia, in manipulation. And there's credible research on that. But I would honestly say that we see a lot of, again, the wolves. Some of the wolves are state actors. Some of the wolves are trolls, anarchists, pranksters, really just trying to mess with people. And then a large section of what we see are what we call, they're profiteers. It makes money, and they can make money on these memes. And the more amplification, the more money they make. And so, lots of times when I talk with people about this research, they'll say, well, who's behind this? And I like to say, well, that's the wrong question, because it's not a who question, it's a what, a why, and a how question, because there's a lot of actors. It's an ecosystem that gives rise to a result and an impact. So yes, there's credible research that state actors are part of this. But is that the only thing? No. Frankly, platform economics and the design of the platforms themselves have a substantial role. And that's one of the things that we look at in the documentary as well.
Right. Yeah. The algorithms are feeding people this content, bringing in ad revenue. I have a question here from an old friend of mine from Beckley, West Virginia, Andrea. And she's also a content creator, and she's in the media space. So she's crafted a nice long question. So I'm going to read it. I spent my formative years in Southern West Virginia and am married to a Kentucky native with extended family there. So Central Appalachia all the way. I visit both areas still. My observation is that certain attitudes and beliefs are passed down from generation to generation via the families, rather than schools, that contribute to a lack of progress in some areas. How can West Virginia schools address these gaps and engage students and the parents who are resistant to the concept of media literacy? Like, are we learning this from our parents? And how does the media combat that?
That is a great question. You see it even in this other research, there is a generational sort of role. There's sort of historic roots to things that play a part in that. And also, I would never want to discount the importance and centrality of family and being a key influence on family. I feel that myself as a parent. But I think that the media has done a disservice. The media itself has done a disservice to gaining the trust historically, not just recently, but historically, that gives rise to that. And I'm from the Ozarks, the other sort of hillbilly part of America, and I grew up with a lot of the sense of shame and distrust of media and systems, because they were, if you grow up poor, and if you don't have access to healthcare, doctors are there's suspicion of those systems. You have fear of social workers. They're going to take you away because your parents didn't take you to a doctor that they couldn't afford to begin with or even have access to. You don't see yourself represented in media, and when you do, it's really poorly. So that distrust is, and the repair that needs to happen of that distrust is historic. I mean, not just at all for poor white communities, but many communities that are not accurately represented in media. So I think that's it's taken decades for us to have this problem, and I think it will take decades for us to repair the problem.
But it sounds to me like there are both deeper problems happening in Appalachia in the realm of media and messaging around extremism, but there are also some hopeful signs that youth are more savvy, youth are more engaged, that perhaps the states in Appalachia and in West Virginia are becoming more diverse. So I know you're doing a whole documentary about Islam in West Virginia. So there's a hopeful side to this as well, right? I hope.
Oh no, yeah, absolutely. And I'm super excited about the work that we do with young people. They are drafting their own narratives and future narratives for this region that I think will transcend some of these problems. And so, yeah, no, I actually feel incredibly optimistic.
And Kristen, are you optimistic about your future as a journalist in West Virginia?
Yeah, if you would have asked me that a couple years ago, I would have been like, no, I'm not staying in West Virginia. But I think another conversation to have about young people and kind of this digital atmosphere is just the ability to kind of create your own opportunities and innovate in the way that you want. So we're seeing a lot of really cool innovation on TikTok and seeing some projects start up that are being led by young people in this region. And so I'm a huge advocate for young people. I think newsrooms need young people more than they realize. And I think I'm really excited to see what this generation does in the future.
For your fellow students at WVU's journalism school, what were some of the topics that were on top of mind for them? Like what were their aspirations and inspirations?
Yeah, I think whenever you start out in journalism school, at least when I did, and with my friends, the conversation again was like, okay, what city are you going to work in? Mm-hmm. And I've seen people like go to New York and then realize that it just wasn't the place for them. It's the place for some people, but it just wasn't for them. So they come back to the region, whether it's to Maryland, West Virginia, Kentucky, or they go, somewhere else in the region, wherever they can find a job. And it's really cool to kind of see like people come back and be spread throughout. But I think the conversation really was like, are we going to find a job? Whenever I started school, I think 6 years ago now, I feel like the industry was really in this large shift.
Oh, we lost. Oh, there she is.
I'm here. Oh, sorry. So I was saying that whenever, yeah, my cat decided to join the call. So there, whenever I started school 6 years ago, there was this kind of this disconnect between, like Dana was saying, my professors and people who are in older generations, and then the people that I was in class with, where the conversation was really about how competitive the industry was, how little job opportunities there were. And so really around me, I was seeing this conversation of, okay, well, if I can't find a job, how do I create one? And so my friends and some of my friends and I, we started our own magazine on campus that was just for young people that Dana actually was our advisor. And it was just this really amazing kind of grouping, where we all grouped together to create our own opportunities, experiment the way that we wanted to. And now like I've passed on that magazine to some of my younger friends who are just doing amazing things with it. And that, I think that's just one example of how innovative and savvy, like Dana said, young people are. It's really exciting to see.
That's cool. A friend of mine from West Virginia on Facebook this morning just announced some job openings for journalists. So for any of your friends and colleagues who don't want to cover the important issues we've been talking about and would rather cover travel in West Virginia and go whitewater rafting for the year, there are a couple good gigs out there available. Does anyone else have any more questions? I posted a link to the survey for this event. Please, everyone, and that's for those of you on Zoom, please fill it out. Let us know how we're doing.
May I ask both, Kristen and Pat?
I was going to ask you to ask a question.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much for your very interesting and productive discussion. I'm sure that all my students are interested in these characteristics and this information. So could you please tell some words? I know that many students of mine are interested in visual images, political cartoons, memes, movie representations. Could you please tell some words about typical images of the Appalachian area in visual representations, American representations? Okay, thank you.
Well, it's funny that you say that because we're starting a stocks photo and video and drone footage service specifically because, like, if I go to try and find images for 100 Days in Appalachia from the standard, stock services, it's just like the same 4 images of coal miners. And so we're actually, but we have amazing creators and media makers and videographers and artists and illustrators and people doing documentary work all across the region that you never see in that Google search. So we're trying to aggregate. We have a database right now that's posted off of our site that has like links to their work. There's an incredible curated gallery by one of our contributing editors. His name is Roger May, and it's called Looking at Appalachia, which you could probably just Google it and find it. That's just amazing. And but we're actually trying to bring all of those internal sort of talent together and make it a place where it's accessible so you can find and see those images.
Thank you.
And what about images from cinema that depict West Virginia or Appalachia or the hillbilly stereotype? Like that would be an interesting thing to share.
Yeah, we've written about that. So we have
stereotypical images.
Well, we actually have a couple stories where these stories perform really well for us too, because I think people are fascinated by it. But we did a story called Hillbilly Horror that actually looks at depictions of stereotypes of the region in different horror films. We just do something recently, Kristen, that looked at, I'm trying to remember what it was, but there's another one.
Oh, Hillbilly Elegy, we did.
Oh yeah, we've talked about that too.
Yeah. Victoria, I will put together a list for you and because this was one of the first things that came to mind for me and you and your audience is, where have you seen depictions of Appalachia? Because I know that you and your students are consuming American television, American film. So I think that would be an interesting thing is to put together some examples of this is when you were seeing this, you were seeing the stereotypes about us.
A documentary that might be great for your students is actually called Hillbilly. And we screened it and we've talked with the filmmaker at 100 Days and you can get it on Netflix, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. And if you don't know her, Michael, you should meet her because she's in LA. She's a filmmaker in LA from West Virginia. And basically her whole documentary is sort of discussing those media stereotypes. So it's a great, introduction to that.
Sounds great. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
I know a few documentary filmmakers in LA from West Virginia, and there's a lot of interest. I mean, there's so many topics to cover, and there are a lot of people working on these. So it's an interesting time. Okay, I don't have any more questions coming in, and we're past time. Dana and Kristen, thank you so much. Victoria, thank you for hosting us there in Moscow.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's do this in person in the fall.
Yes, I have such hope.
Great. Okay, well then we're going to sign off. Thank you, everyone, and have a for those of you in the U.S., have a wonderful holiday weekend, and for those of you in Moscow, good luck with your final exams.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.